All right, so I'm so excited about this event today. Dr. Zegart, how are you today?
I am good. How are you? Please call me Amy.
Oh, okay. Oh my goodness. Okay, Amy, everyone, this is a new moment in my life right now. So before I introduce Amy, I definitely want to share a personal story that Amy was my professor at UCLA a long time ago in a policy class that I fell in love with. And here's the funny part. I didn't do well in the class, which prompted me to do better. And so because of that motivation, I'm so excited that I'm here now in the national security space and being a woman, being a Black woman, and being inspired by you, Amy. So I just want to say thank you so much for that.
I am so honored to be back with you. I'm so excited you stuck with the class and that you're going to get your PhD this year. So it's a delight for me to be with you too.
All right, so let's get going. I want to introduce our wonderful guest today. Today we have Dr. Amy Zegart, who's a senior fellow at the Hoover Institute and a professor of political science and past co-director of Stanford's Center for International Security and Cooperation, and is also a contributing writer at The Atlantic and has been featured in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Foreign Affairs. She has previously served as a national security analyst on CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, and National Public Radio. In September 2021, The Atlantic published two pieces by Dr. Zegart on the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, and also a recent broadcast on the same topic. But we're going to talk about a lot of things today, but we're here to talk about her wonderful, wonderful book. And I love the title. I love the title of the book, Spies, Lies, and Algorithms. And then we'll also talk about a few other things, like a recent article that she wrote about Ukraine and Russia. But before we get into all of that, I just want to say welcome. How are you today?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me. And I have to say, of course, since I lived in Los Angeles for a long time, and taught at UCLA, I've been a member of the Pacific Council for many, many years. So it's really nice to be a part of this community and share this book with everyone who's tuning in today.
I agree. I'm somewhat recent. I think this is my second year in the council, and I got to say it's been a wonderful experience to be involved in the community. It really has been. So I turn it over to you.
Okay. So what we thought we would do for everybody today is I'll just give you a few minutes of sort of scene setter remarks. So you don't have to read the book, though I would love for you to read the book. I'm actually teaching this new book in my Stanford course starting next week. But I'll give you the scene setter set of remarks, and then Noel and I will just have a conversation, and then I think we'll be able to answer questions that all of you can put in the Q&A. So I look forward to that part as well. So what I thought I would do is start by sharing with you all, the book actually started in a UCLA classroom. And it started when I polled my students and I asked them what they knew about intelligence and where they got their information about intelligence. And this was many years ago. This was a time of hot button intelligence issues, a ROC WMD failure, warrantless surveillance, detention and interrogation. So a lot of issues about intelligence playing out in the news. And it turns out that my students, like most Americans, didn't know anything about US intelligence agencies. And what they did know, they learned from spy-themed entertainment. And so the first poll that I did of my students at UCLA found, and it wasn't particularly scientific, it was only about 100 students, found that those who frequently watch spy-themed entertainment were statistically more likely to approve of aggressive counterterrorism techniques like waterboarding, for example. And then I did national polls to see whether this was a more general phenomenon, and I found that it was. And so I sort of followed this path, and originally I wanted to write a book that I affectionately referred to as Intelligence 101. Sort of a textbook for students and a general audience to explain everything you wanted to know about espionage, but were afraid to ask. And then something happened, which is, of course, sometimes it takes a long time for a professor to finish a book, and the world changed. And the rise of emerging technologies has created a profoundly different world for our intelligence agencies than when I first started teaching about them at UCLA a long time ago. And so this book has become an Intelligence 2.0 book. So the question I really ask in the book is not just about the past of intelligence, but what the future holds. and specifically how emerging technologies are challenging every aspect of the intelligence business. And we're going to talk about this, I know, but we see this playing out in real time with the release of intelligence about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So one way to think about emerging technology, first, what are emerging technologies? And think about a combination of things, internet connectivity and social media. We think about artificial intelligence transforming business and economics. It's transforming intelligence too. Quantum computing, the commercial satellite revolution. Think about the images that we use in Google Maps to navigate to where we want to go, or what we're seeing in the New York Times, the satellite imagery about troop movements in Ukraine. Synthetic biology and more. When you think about all of these emerging technologies, they're converging at one time. And that convergence is driving what I call the 5 mores for US intelligence agencies. And those mores are, very briefly, number one, technology is creating more threats. So if we were having this conversation back when we were at UCLA years ago, we might talk about, the top threats to the United States in the Cold War, the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union. Well, today, of course, the threat landscape is much more complex and varied, and technology is a key reason why. So if we think about cyber threats, for example, for all of American history until now, 2 things really protected the United States from foreign adversaries: power and geography. Right? Our powerful military protected us. Our geography, those 2 oceans that separated us from the bad neighborhoods of the rest of the world, protected the United States. But power and geography don't protect us in cyberspace. The US is simultaneously one of the most powerful and most vulnerable actors in cyberspace, and the neighborhoods are all connected online. We can't get away from them. So the first more is more threats. Technology is creating more threats for our intelligence agencies to deal with. The second more is more speed. Intelligence has to move at the speed of relevance. A decision maker needs intelligence when they need it, right? Will Putin invade Ukraine? What are China's nuclear missile silos for example? And so that's accelerating too, thanks to technology. And so if we look at the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, President Kennedy had 13 hours to decide what the intelligence meant when those U-2 surveillance planes snapped those fateful photographs, and the time when he had to announce to the world what US policy would be. He had 13 days. On 9/11, President Bush had 13 hours between the time of the first World Trade Center attacks, assessing what the intelligence meant, and delivering a policy address to the world about what he would do. Today in cyberspace, we have more like 13 minutes or 13 seconds, or maybe we're too late, because we know that cyber attacks can get into our systems and be there for months before they're ever detected. So speed is much faster now for intelligence agencies than it has been in the past, driven by technology. So more threats, more speed. The third more data. We are drowning in data, and intelligence analysts are too. Just to give you some sense, more than half the world is online. More people have cell phones today than running water. And the amount of data on Earth is estimated to double every 2 years. So intelligence is a race for insight, right? To help policymakers better understand threats and opportunities faster and better than our adversaries do. And those insights are getting harder and harder to find amidst all of this data that is growing exponentially. So we have more threats, more speed, more data. The fourth more, driven by technology for intelligence today, more customers who need intelligence, who don't have security clearances and don't work in the US government. Voters today need intelligence about foreign election interference in order to participate in our democracy. Tech leaders here in Silicon Valley, where I am, need intelligence about threats to and through their technical platforms. Critical infrastructure companies like financial services companies and water and power companies, they need intelligence too. What does this mean? It means that our secret intelligence agencies have to now produce for the open. And that is an unnatural act. It is a new kind of effort for them to not just produce information for the classified world. So more customers. And then there's the fifth more, which is perhaps the most far-reaching more that we have to contend with, and that is more intelligence competitors today. So spying and collecting and analyzing intelligence isn't just for governments anymore. We see this in Ukraine right now. Think about all the people and organizations in the world creating and analyzing open source intelligence or information that is publicly available. It used to be that you had to have $1 billion spy satellite launched by a superpower in order to get the kind of remote sensing or imagery and analysis that satellites can provide. But now we have low-cost eyes in the skies for just about anybody who wants them. And so I have a whole chapter in the book that was really started by a conversation I had in the hallway with a colleague that looks at this world of open source intelligence with respect to nuclear threats. Who's tracking nuclear threats and how are they doing it outside of governments? What's the power of open source intelligence today? The upshot of these 5 mores is that I think we are facing an adapt or fail moment in intelligence that is akin to the adapt or fail moment that we faced right around 9/11. Technology is transforming economics and geopolitics, and our intelligence agencies need to radically rethink how open source intelligence works, how technology is affecting them, and how they can harness emerging technologies better to adapt to this new technological world. I'm going to stop there and leave it open for our conversation.
Thank you so much. I love the 5 mores. That was incredible. And it takes me to my first question for you. So you mentioned that intelligence, it's not just up to the agencies now. And because of technology, there's also this public engagement with intelligence, disinformation, misinformation, and where you're getting your information from. How can the community, the larger intelligence community, combat disinformation, especially as we're in a situation now with Russia and Ukraine, and there's disinformation and misinformation all over the place?
Oh, it's such a challenge. Thanks for the softball starting question. So, I think we're seeing a new strategy playing out right now. So it feels like we've been at the receiving end of disinformation for the past several years. The Russians are pros when it comes to deception operations. They've been doing it for a long time, and they've used cyber-enabled deception much to great skill. But what we're seeing now is an unprecedented release of intelligence information about the war in Ukraine. We've never seen an administration declassify so much in such detail, so fast, so persistently over time. And so I think there are 3 reasons why the Biden administration is engaging in this strategy. And I think it's a very clever strategy. The first is what, your question about information warfare. It's inoculation. Until now, the lie got out before the truth, particularly from Vladimir Putin. And what the Biden administration has done is to say, watch out, the Kremlin's about to con the world. They're going to say X, Y, and Z. Don't believe what is coming out of the Kremlin. And so I think that had a very useful effect in rallying the allies and alerting the world that the US knew what Putin was up to. And by the way, the domestic population in Russia got that information too, right? Because it was before the media blackout in Russia. You had 2 competing narratives, Putin saying he wasn't going to invade and the allies saying he was. So I think inoculation, and it's a new way of fighting information warfare, which is getting the truth out of the gate first and being proactive about revealing what we know from intelligence rather than just keeping it close to the vest. But I think there are 2 other goals of this strategy. The second, very quickly, is just friction. Putin is a former KGB officer, and the more that we're revealing what we know, the more he's stewing in his juices about who can I trust? What systems can I trust? How do they know what they know? Feeding his paranoia. And the more he's focused on that, the less he can focus on waging offensive actions in Ukraine. And so that's a page right out of Cyber Command's playbook: create friction in your adversary. And then I think the third goal is making it harder for third-party countries like China to sit on the sidelines under the fig leaf excuses that the Russian regime is providing about what it's doing in Ukraine. And so when you reveal to the world what intelligence is saying, and in particular with China, that Chinese leaders knew about the invasion beforehand and asked that it be delayed until after the Beijing Olympics, for example. You're basically communicating to the world, we're not looking the other way. You cannot sit on the sidelines. You cannot say that you're going to play both sides on this, that China has to take a side, and it makes it more costly for China. And that's advantageous to the United States as well. So it's a long answer to a really good question.
Thank you so much for that. And I can definitely talk about threats all day long, but we definitely want to make sure we cover more information about this exciting book. And before we got started, I'd mentioned to you that I was super excited about chapter 2, particularly as you talk about spytainment. And I'll tell you why I'm very, very interested in this, because one of the reasons I came to your class, I had just read a conspiratorial book, Behold the Pale Horse. And I was just so invested in this book. But I came to your class thinking that there was some level of fact in this largely conspiratorial book. And I think a lot of Americans, kind of are treated in that way to a lot of conspiracy theories that that may put the government in a certain light, and you buy into these narratives. So can you speak a little bit more about what you talk about in chapter 2 around spytainment?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you came to class, especially if you were reading a conspiratorial book before you came. That makes me doubly glad you took my class. So, chapter 2 in the book really looks at how fictional spies are influencing real policy. And so, I don't want to be too much of a naysayer about the entertainment industry. My husband's a retired screenwriter. I think creative license is a really important thing. But there have been some really serious consequences to the pervasiveness of spy themed entertainment. So the first I mentioned already, which is public opinion. So people believe conspiracy theories, and conspiracy theories make for great plot lines in TV and in the movies. And so I think, what we see is in many other areas, entertainment influences opinion as well. So the CSI effect, prosecutors and defense attorneys often talk about the fancy forensic evidence that's expected in trials because of television. Well, I found the same kind of influence on public opinion of spy-themed entertainment. And I also found that spy-themed entertainment has influenced real intelligence policy. So I'll give you just a couple of examples. When Leon Panetta was nominated to be the CIA director, at his confirmation hearing, senators on the Intelligence Committee asked Leon Panetta what he would do if he encountered a ticking time bomb scenario. You know the situation. There's a terrorist in custody. They believe that this person has information about an imminent terrorist attack. How are you going to elicit this information from this person you have in custody? Experts have long argued ticking time bomb scenarios are completely fictional, that they've never happened in real life. And yet we see them on 24 and other shows frequently. And so here we have, in a confirmation hearing of a CIA director, a question about a plot line from a TV show, and the nominee took it seriously. And what he said was dubbed the Jack Bauer exception to Panetta's opposition to enhanced interrogation techniques. I found a number of other examples of Supreme Court justices, military officers being deployed, members of Congress that actually they watch the same things we do, using spy-themed entertainment as a basis for their policy decisions. And part of the problem is that they have very few other places to turn. Spy-themed entertainment has become adult education. And so that's one of the reasons I felt so strongly about writing this book and teaching this class, is to separate fact from fiction and to provide a resource for people to better understand the intelligence business.
Thank you for that. And I just want to say really quickly to the audience members, I see that there are a lot, questions lining up in the queue. In about 18 minutes or so, we're going to open it up to the public. So make sure you get your questions in there so you can ask Dr. Zegart your questions. So my next question ties into what you were talking about. So there's an education cost in terms of relying on these types of documents, or whatever you want to call them. I tend to think of film and things like that as some sort of a document. And how that factors into the public's understanding of what intelligence is and isn't. So in your third chapter, you talk about this history about how our intelligence community is relatively new. So can you say more about that? And do you think that because it is relatively new, it took us a while to kind of catch up in terms of cyber warfare?
Yeah, so if you look really broadly at intelligence history, we're newcomers to this world of espionage. And so, the oldest intelligence reports were chiseled on clay tablets 3,000 years ago. The Russians have been engaged in intelligence for hundreds of years, the Chinese for thousands of years. And so intelligence really was part of the Revolutionary War, and then it really got discarded for a long time. So we didn't have a permanent peacetime intelligence organization until after World War II. And so I think that's one of the reasons why, our capabilities, particularly when it comes to covert operations, are relatively new compared to what other countries have been doing. Now, with cybersecurity, it's really interesting. The sort of cyber threat, you can trace how the intelligence community assessed the cyber threat by looking at annual threat assessments. These are unclassified. They deliver them to Congress. They just had a hearing a couple of weeks ago. And notably, if you look at those threat assessments in 2007, that annual threat assessment of dangers to the United States did not include the word cyber once, not once in 2007. So we were slow to pick up on the cyber threat. Now, it quickly vaulted to the top of the threat list, sort of in subsequent years, but that threat is changing really quickly. And so, you look at in 2012, for example, the cyber threat was really envisioned to be more like a Pearl Harbor-like attack, physical destructive attack. But then you look fast forward 5 years from there, what was the main cyber threat to American democracy? It was hacking our minds, not machines. It was Russian election interference, sowing distrust and polarizing our democracy. So it's hard because the intelligence landscape never sleeps. The threat landscape never sleeps. And our cyber capabilities are much better than they were, but it's a constant need to adapt to better understanding how these threats are evolving.
Thank you so much for mentioning that. I completely agree. And because, there definitely is a time crunch and I want to ask you like 1,500 more questions, I'm going to tie the next two questions together. So in the following chapters, you talk about this really important thing. It ties into the Russia-Ukraine war. I have a lot of my students asking me, well, what about Iraq? What about so-called weapons of mass destruction? And you talk about that in the following chapter. Can you speak more to that? Like, how do you explain that difference and what's largely been categorized as an intelligence failure to what people are seeing in Ukraine and Russia? I feel like I know the difference, but just if you're just looking and if you don't have like this detailed engagement with this kind of information, how do you explain it?
So I guess there are two parts to that question. One is, how do we know when a failure is a failure? And with Iraq WMD, it's clear it was a colossal intelligence failure. I'll talk about that in a minute. But it's not so clear with many other examples. So imagine with Russia and Ukraine that are revealing the intelligence about what Putin intended to do, about his false flag operations, the phony pretext for invasion. Imagine that when that got revealed, he decided, you know what, I'm not going to invade. We would be having a conversation right now about what a terrible intelligence failure that was, that our intelligence agencies said he was going to invade, and in fact, he didn't. When in reality, that would have been an intelligence success. So intelligence success, as you know, requires that intelligence agencies analyze the situation well and that policymakers take action. And so you can have an intelligence success and a policy failure, but it's called an intelligence failure. Right. So I was just talking with some journalists yesterday, and my plea to them was, please have a more nuanced understanding of how we know what's a success and what's a failure. So I think they can be indistinguishable, right? What looks like a failure is actually a success, and maybe what looks like a success at one point in time, right? Like arming the Mujahideen in Afghanistan after the Soviet invasion, looks like a failure later on because the Mujahideen turns into Al-Qaeda. So it's more complicated. But how do we end up doing so well with Russia? And how do we end up failing so badly in Iraq? And I have a chapter that looks at the cognitive biases that we all have, the wiring in our brain that makes it hard to see what there is to be seen. And there were many of these cognitive biases that were at work in Iraq. There was confirmation bias. Analysts tended to focus on information that confirm their prior beliefs rather than information, and discount any intelligence that might raise questions about their prior beliefs. There was optimism bias. There was mirror imaging. We thought that Saddam would behave as we would behave. So a number of common afflictions in our sort of mental processing really explained a lot of the intelligence failures with respect to Iraq. Now, since then, there's been a lot of effort to try to mitigate those problems. So dissents play a bigger role in big national intelligence estimates. These are the major products. It's important to have dissenting views because it challenges your assumptions, right, and your biases. There are red teams now that scrub and provide a contrarian view. That's helpful too. But we're never going to eliminate those problems. This is a really hard set of issues. You know, if we were to say, what is Xi Jinping's plan with respect to Taiwan? Xi Jinping may not know the answer to that, right? So expecting intelligence agencies to have that pinpoint accuracy is an unrealistic expectation, but we have to be able to do better than the Iraq WMD fiasco.
Absolutely. So the next question I want to ask you is about congressional oversight. We won't have a chance to delve into all the chapters because I absolutely want to hear more about traitors, but I feel like, just to kind of round out this conversation in terms of the role of the government plays in all of this. So what are your thoughts and feelings about congressional oversight? You have a chapter about it in the book.
So, I'm so glad you asked me about that because this is where I get to say, here's a political science view of congressional oversight. The normal narrative is oversight varies depending on who's president and who's running the committees. But political scientists were trained to look for general explanations. And so what I find is oversight is almost always bad. And why is it almost always bad? Because there are weak incentives for members of Congress to do a better job. I mean, some members of Congress care a lot. They do a very great job at oversight, but they're the exception, not the rule. And the reason they're the exception is that voters don't reward members of Congress for overseeing the intelligence community. They can't even talk about what they do in the districts back home. I always say there's no Iowa for intelligence. So if you're a representative from Iowa, you're going to be an expert in agriculture because if you're not, you won't get reelected. So that home industry gives you an incentive to learn about the business. There's no home state for intelligence where members of Congress have to master the arts of the business or risk not getting reelected. And so they in order to do their homework, they have to go to secure facilities without their staff, and it takes a lot of time. And that's the thing that's most valuable for members of Congress. So we shouldn't be surprised that Congress does such a bad job in general of overseeing our intelligence community because voters don't care and voters don't reward members of Congress for doing it. So it explains why over time, oversight has always struggled to be effective of our intelligence community.
Thank you for that. And in our last 2 minutes before we open it up, what will the public find surprising about your book?
Oh, I think what they might find surprising, at least is what I found surprising, is this incredible ecosystem of individuals and organizations who are doing open source intelligence. So if you could pick the one area you'd least expect to have everyday citizens really contributing to intelligence, it would be nuclear threats. Right? These are countries that are hiding what they're doing. You'd think governments are the ones that really would corner the market on analyzing nuclear threats. And even here, what I found is this incredible sort of, I call it the Star Wars Cantina, an incredible mixture of people from all walks of life, from physicists to coin dealers that are engaged in tracking nuclear activities in North Korea, Iran, China, et cetera. And what's interesting about this world is, number one, there are huge benefits to this emerging ecosystem with responsible players that are really doing great work, but there are also really significant risks to this ecosystem. Information that's wrong, that goes viral, crisis management. And so to me, this is a glimpse into the future of the emerging intelligence landscape and the need for our government agencies to figure out how to work with these organizations and individuals to improve their tradecraft, to understand and establish ethical standards, so that we can harness the wisdom of the crowds to prevent things like nuclear proliferation.
That is definitely my wheelhouse. It's something that I go to sleep thinking about at night. So should we open it up for questions? Are you ready for that? All right. Okay. So Kevin Hernandez asks, how do you think American intel agencies are collaborating with Ukraine right now?
I mean, all I can say, Kevin, is from the public reporting, it sounds like there's close collaboration with Ukraine. I obviously am not on the inside with access to the classified information. But what we've heard in public testimony is it's unprecedented, near real time sharing of battlefield intelligence. Now, you might ask, why isn't it real time? Why is it near real time? And that gets to questions about counterintelligence. So we're gonna smuggle in a little conversation about traitors, right? So, you always have to worry. Have there been moles, right, or weaknesses or penetrations in an intelligence service? And so one of the reasons why there's a pause in the sharing is to make sure that the right people in Ukraine are getting the intelligence, and you're not delivering that intelligence in ways that Russian moles or Russian intelligence could take advantage of. But I do think that what we're seeing is incredible sharing of intelligence, not just with Ukraine, but with American allies, unprecedented levels of intelligence sharing.
Kevin, I hope that was a sufficient enough answer for you. Thank you so much for that. And we're going to go to Yael. I hope I'm saying that correctly. So let's see. You asked a question about, oh no, you just want to connect with Dr. Zegart. Got it.
Okay. I'm pretty easy to find, just my last name at stanford.edu.
Okay. All right. So, okay, let's go to a question from Alonzo Hill. Alonzo asks, how is the USIC going to attract and retain new talent? Now that's a good question.
Well, it is. And a shout out to Alonzo, my old friend from Los Angeles. It's nice that he joined the call. This talent piece, as he knows really well, is such a crucial part of the equation. That we can talk about organizations and technology all day long, but it really is about the people. And there's a real challenge there, particularly with respect to STEM talent. So when I think about what do intelligence agencies need to do, they need to, number one, understand technologies and how they're shaping geopolitics. Number two, they need to use technologies better. And number three, they need to interact with a wider range of organizations. That all stems from talent. So CIA Director Burns has said one of his top priorities is making it easier to get talent in the door. It takes 2 years to get a job at the CIA today. That security clearance process, that hiring process is too long. The pain points are too high. And especially when you're talking about STEM talent that has lots of alternative jobs, you got to get them in the door faster, or you may never get them in the door. But I also think we need to think about intelligence shouldn't just be for lifers. Intelligence careers also need to be for ambassadors. So I think, I'm sitting here in Silicon Valley. We host at Hoover what we call a Tech Track 2 dialogue between senior leaders in Washington and senior leaders here in the Valley. And I call it the suit hoodie divide. And how can we bridge the suits and the hoodies? And so I think we need to be developing programs for people to go in and out of government and the private sector, particularly in that technological side, much more seamlessly, much more easily, so that they're taking their government experience with them when they go to Facebook or Twitter or a startup company. Because we need to have that collaboration with the private sector, which has a lot more power than private sector firms have had in the past. Really, power is akin to governments in many ways. So the government can't do it alone. And that talent piece is crucial to provide that bridge and that trust between the government and the private sector.
I love this question because I work on this question from the diversity angle in terms of the barrier to entry, and also just not really knowing about what the community is, because of most people come to this through entertainment, right? So it's this kind of education piece, and then it's also this kind of barrier to entry piece that's really, really important. So I really like that question. Okay, so we have an anonymous question referring to your chapter regarding China and the Korean War. The question is China on the sidelines of Putin's war in Ukraine?
Oh boy. Well, not really, right? I mean, China would like to be on the sidelines. So, you've seen, it depends on whether you see the glass as half full or half empty. So China has been relatively muted compared to what it could be saying. And yet we still see that China is peddling this false narrative about US bioweapons programs in Ukraine. China's trying to have it both ways. And what the Biden administration has been doing most recently in the past couple of weeks is really pushing Xi Jinping and his government into the corner, saying you've got to take a stand. I think it's a clever strategy. Whether it will work will be, a work in progress. Because of course, it's one thing to join sanctions against Russia with our allies around the world. By the way, our Asia Pacific allies have notably joined those sanctions too. So it's not just Europe, but you see Japan, for example, South Korea. These are very notable developments because they know what signal they're sending to the Chinese. So, but it's easier to sanction Russia, given Russia's relatively low percentage of the global GDP. And given its focus in hydrocarbons, and given how, compared to China, how it's really not coupled in the same way with the global economy. The question really for China, which I think China is watching, is what would happen if China moves on Taiwan? What would be the reaction there? So this is in some ways a cautionary tale of how these dynamics would play out. Would the Taiwanese resist? Would the world come to their defense? Would we impose sanctions that are so punishing on the Chinese Communist Party? Would that threaten the Chinese Communist Party's domestic stability? These are all questions that national security experts are grappling with, and I'm sure that watchers in Beijing are paying careful attention to.
So I think this is a good time to kind of bring up your most recent article. I feel like we talked about Russia and Ukraine quite a bit. So do you want to speak to what you were going after and what you would like the public to really get out of that particular article?
So the most recent one, and I'm noodling on whether to sort of extend the analysis right now to talk about China, is this a new strategy of intelligence? And I think actually that it is. And I think the strategy with respect to China is revealing to coerce. So if you think about it's covert action logic in reverse. So covert action, what distinguishes covert action from overt action is one thing. It's that the United States makes it so that we deny publicly our responsibility, right? Our role in some particular action. It's not the nature of the deed. So covert actions that are regime change are called coups. Overt actions that are regime change are called wars. So we do covert things and overt things is the same things, but what makes it covert is that we hide our responsibility. Now, why do we do this? One of the reasons is it makes it easier for other countries to help. And so in Afghanistan, for example, we had a covert action to arm the Mujahideen, and everyone knew what we were doing. But why did we go along with the fig leaf? Well, we went along with the fig leaf so that the Pakistanis and the Egyptians could aid us without fear of Soviet reprisal. So it gives them a place to hide. Now we're flipping that script and saying, actually, we're not going to give third-party countries a place to hide. We're going to reveal what's going on to coerce them, to limit their room to maneuver, to increase their cost of action. And so I think we're going to see more of this in the future. I think intelligence connected to policy and the strategic release of secrets is going to play a much bigger role in foreign policy to come, particularly with respect to China.
I completely agree. Brian Chase has a really good and interesting question. What are some challenges or opportunities cryptocurrency has created for the IC, particularly with regard to the dark web and economic sanctions?
Oh, this is where I say I'm not a crypto expert, but I'll give you my best take coming from the outside. which is cryptocurrency, I think, has two real challenges from a national security perspective. Number one, it makes bad guys easier to hide their financial dealings. So bad guys of all sorts, whether it's ransomware, whether it's old-fashioned crime, whether it's North Korea trying to steal and use cyber attacks to gain cryptocurrency. It makes it easier for nefarious actors of all types to fund and profit from what they're doing. So that's sort of problem number one. But there's problem number two, which is central bank cryptocurrency. So one of the concerns is that the less that the United States becomes the sort of pillar of global economic infrastructure, the weaker our sanctions will be. And so one of the reasons I think we saw a reluctance to kick the Russians out of SWIFT, for example, was it's going to accelerate this move toward central bank cryptocurrencies and alternative economic infrastructure. And the effect of that will be that countries will be out of the reach of US sanctions. That's a big deal, right? So if we're thinking about what's a really important tool in our foreign policy toolkit, economic leverage is one of them. And so the concern is that the emergence of these alternative currencies undermines the dollar, undermines the current global economic infrastructure, and weakens the hands of the United States when it comes to punishing bad actors like Iran or North Korea or Russia.
Thank you for that. I try explaining that to people, but I think that's not what they want to hear. It's, it's the sexy thing to talk about, right? Thank you so much for that. And we have a question from David Rosenblum. How and with whom do US intelligence agencies cooperate with foreign intelligence areas? Is there specialization where countries have distinctive technology, issue, or geography expertise that is leveraged among the US and its allies?
We do collaborate a lot with allies. So one of the enduring benefits we have vis-a-vis competition with China is China has customers, but we have allies. And so from an intelligence perspective, that's a huge advantage. So the closest intelligence sharing is with a group of countries called the Five Eyes. And it's the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And that relationship has been very strong for a long time. But there's also intelligence sharing with other countries that do have distinctive areas of expertise. And so it's been in the public domain for a long time that the Saudis, for example, have good intelligence about activities in the Middle Eastern region. The Israelis, we also share intelligence with. Now, not everybody shares everything. So outside of that Five Eyes network, there's some sharing, but not as much. Oh, and by the way, allies spy on each other too. So almost every country spies on almost every other country. I would say the Five Eyes are an exception, but the Israelis have spied on the United States. The French have spied on the United States. So it's important to bear that in mind when we think about things like the Snowden revelations, that Europeans were shocked to find that the United States was conducting intelligence to better understand foreign perspectives on things like trade agreements and the rest, that our allies are doing the same thing, right? It's to gain insight and to gain advantage, whether it's a trade dispute, an agreement, or diplomacy or war.
Thank you for that. And so right now I'm going to switch it up a little bit, and I want to get more into who you are and how you came to this work as a woman in this space, as a civilian. How did you come to this work?
Completely by accident and dumb luck.
So I can kind of understand.
I mean, so what happened was I had worked in the National Security Council staff, and I came back to Stanford where I was doing my doctorate. And I went to my doctoral advisor, a woman named Condi Rice, back before she was Secretary of State or National Security Advisor. And I said, I have my dissertation topic. I'm going to write my dissertation on the National Security Council staff and its history. And she said, in a way that was much more diplomatic than I heard it, that's a terrible topic. She said, go back to the library. You need to have more than one case. You need to explain causes and effects, and that's hard to do with a single case. So she sent me back to the basement of the library. And so I ended up finding my way to at the time, a little known piece of legislation called the National Security Act of 1947. And you're nodding because you know what it is, because you're in the room. And it's a crucial piece of legislation that gave rise to our modern national security apparatus. And one of the agencies that I ended up including in my dissertation was little debated in the 1940s, and it was called the Central Intelligence Agency. And once I got sort of introduced to intelligence, I was hooked, probably because I too watch spy-themed entertainment. But a lot of it is I found the mission really interesting. And I find the analytic side of what the CIA does in particular endlessly fascinating, because academics are analysts.
Mhm.
And so a lot of the same challenges that people in the agency face, how do we know it when we see it? How do we prove or disprove a hypothesis, is the stuff that academics do too. So I've been hooked on intelligence ever since.
Wow, I have a very similar story. And by the way, she told me no matter what I do, get tenure. So
It's good advice. She's been giving that advice for a long time.
yes. So thank you so much for telling us how you came to this space and how over time this developed for you, because I think it's really important to hear the human side of this, and I think as civilians in this space, we kind of provide a unique perspective to all of this. So in terms
I just add one other thing, which I think is so important when we're talking about, what encourages people to do things where there aren't many people like us.
Mhm.
It's mentorship.
Mm,
And it's mentorship by people who have done it before, who, I was really lucky to have Condi Rice as my doctoral advisor, but it's mentorship by lots of other people too, that believe we have something to add to the conversation. So we talked earlier about my co-teacher of the class that you took at UCLA was the chancellor, Al Carnesale. And so it's important, I think, to spend that time paying it forward and mentoring the next generation wherever you can. And that's how we enlist the top talent across our country to help make the country better and to go into public service.
I completely agree. And I see this as a form of public service. I absolutely do. So what do you want the public to know? Like what's the overall, if you have to think about your North Star with this project, what's the one takeaway you want the public to know?
I think this might be a surprising answer for you. The one most important thing, I've been thinking about this a lot since I'm teaching this class, is empathy. And what I mean by that is, if my students who are taking my class and readers who read the book walk away with one thing, I hope it's, wow, this stuff is a lot harder and more complicated than I thought it was. And particularly in these polarized times where we think, well, that's a stupid policy decision, or how could they possibly get that wrong? You may not agree with everything that intelligence officials do, but it's important to understand the challenges and the constraints that they're facing so that we understand what it is that they do, what's realistic and what isn't. And we walk in the shoes of others so we can understand better how people are trying to do the right thing. And that's why I do simulations in my class too. I want my students to experience even a little bit that pressure of having to make that decision as Secretary of Defense or as president, to walk in the shoes of others. I mean, I'm sure you probably don't remember much from your classes, including the one that I taught, because we don't as we go through life, but we remember those moments of empathy and thinking, wow, that was a lot more difficult than I thought it was.
I love that. One of the projects that I work on with Pacific Council is to evacuate our allies in the Afghan resettlement space. And one of the philosophies is empathy, in terms of, yes, this is a massive geopolitical situation, but this is a human security situation. We're talking about human beings, and there's this, I think when you get your information about the community from, movies and books and stuff like that, you tend to think that no one's paying attention to the human cost, the human element, and that's just not true. And so I am so happy you brought that point up.
And I will say one of the parts of the book that I'm really proud of is, yes, I wanted to have my nerdy analytic perspective of the intelligence business, but I also wanted to share voices of people who have led inside these agencies. And so I have part of a chapter where I asked former senior intelligence officials questions like, when did you tell your kids what you did? And what was their reaction? I asked them what their ethical challenges were and how they dealt with them. And then I asked them about their best and worst days in their careers, because I thought it was really important to let those voices speak by people who normally are pretty reticent about speaking publicly about their careers and their lives. And that's one of my favorite parts of the book.
I'm glad you brought that up. Speaking to mentors, I just feel so incredibly blessed to have strong women as mentors. And over the summer, I had the opportunity to meet one of my mentors face to face. We had lunch in Bethesda, and we're sitting there and we're talking. And, here's this woman, like, really, really high up in the defense community. And she told me that her master's was about ethics. And so was my master's at Harvard. It was about ethics. So I think this is such an important part of the analysis, to talk about ethics, to talk about empathy, to talk about the human element of it. So I'm just really excited that you incorporated some of those themes in your book. Okay, so here's kind of a big, small question for you. What keeps you up at night?
Oh, well, mostly my kids. You can worry about macro things and you can worry about micro things. But if I'm thinking about the national security threat space, what keeps me up at night is us. That I worry much more, the single greatest threat to the United States is the United States. Our polarization, our unraveling of our democracy, our distrust of one another. I think any foreign challenge we can confront if we come together as a country, not that we always agree, but we have a consensus about our values, that what matters to us, that we are one people, that all of us are Americans. And I worry that fabric is unraveling. And if I had to focus on one thing that does give me night frights, it would be that, because we can deal with any challenge in the world if we get that piece right.
Amy, you won't believe this, but I swear I just had a policy paper with New America saying exactly that about values. Exactly that.
That's your answer too.
Yes, it is. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Especially from an identity perspective, it definitely keeps me up at night. It definitely does. So I just want to make sure that, let me make sure I have everyone's questions in here, because there are a few more. Jerry says, thank you for doing the talk today.
Thank you, Jerry. Thank you for having me and doing all the great work at the Pacific Council.
Absolutely. I completely agree. All right. So as we wrap up, I do have one kind of final question in terms of, what do we do? How do we begin to, how do we begin to repair the kind of internal instability that absolutely has an impact on what's happening internationally? And then secondly, what are your thoughts about the possibility of the US engaging in the war with Russia and Ukraine? Do you think that's a possibility?
So we have to end on a more optimistic note.
I promise.
So that's what I'm going to try to do. So let me start with what do I think the intelligence community should do to deal with the challenges that it faces, and then pivot a little bit to what can we all do. So I think that one of the most important things that we need to do is figure out how to enable more rapid adaptation inside our 18 agencies in the US intelligence community. I think most people don't realize there are 18 of them. So it's a big behemoth community. And from my research, what I found is I think open source intelligence is going to be the name of the game. So until now, it really has been secrets that are foundational to intelligence. And then we sprinkle the open source intelligence on top. That is reversing, where there's so much that's publicly available. There's so much insight that we can glean. The last time Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, the best intelligence came from selfies, not secrets, right? Russian soldiers taking photos of themselves and posting them on social media. And so this is a radical new world, and we need a new organization to help confront it. So there are reform efforts underway, I think good ones in the intelligence community. But I think, and I've been proposing, that we create a new open source intelligence agency dedicated to getting this piece right. Now, I hasten to make that suggestion because we have 18 and coordination is always a challenge. So why do we need a 19th agency? Because secret agencies will always favor secrets. That's their DNA. And so and as one intelligence official put it to me, we think that if a piece of information cost $1 trillion to get, it must be worth $1 trillion. And that's not true today. And so I think to attract the talent that Alonzo Hill asked about, to have a test bed for adopting new technological tools like algorithms and machine learning, and to get the jump on open source intelligence, we need a dedicated agency. And I think we can get one. And there's a lot more conversation about whether we should do this and how to do this taking place right now in Washington. So that if I were queen of the world for a day, that would be my number one sort of enabling reform. I also think we need to realize how much advantage we have in this country with respect to geopolitics. Our diversity is an advantage. It's an intelligence advantage. We have people that come from all over, understand cultures from all over, speak lots of languages. It's a huge intelligence advantage that we can tap. Our innovation ecosystem is an advantage, and our values are an advantage. And so I keep thinking about, there's one Soviet spy for the United States that I write about in my counterintelligence chapter, codenamed Top Hat, incredibly valuable asset for the United States, was executed for what he did for us.
Right.
He never asked for a penny. Why did he risk his life and his family to spy for years for the United States? Because he believed in democracy, because he believed in who we were. And so I think these are really enduring advantages that we can do more with, not just with intelligence, but for geopolitics.
Thank you for that. We have one more question that just came in. Oh, it's just more of it's a thank you. So we're going to end on a positive note. So what are you hopeful about?
I'm most hopeful, I think, about, well, two things. Number one, as horrific as this moment is in Ukraine, it's a wake-up call for the world. It's a wake-up call for democracies. It's a reinvigorated NATO alliance. It is a reinvigorated bipartisan, for the moment, United States in support of freedom in Ukraine. It's a reminder of how fiercely the Ukrainians are fighting for freedoms that many of us may have taken for granted. And so in the long term, in the short term, the human toll is crushing. It's devastating. I have a student who's Ukrainian who is in Poland right now, trying to help. So it's personal, right? But I think over the long term, we may see a geopolitical alignment and a reinvigoration of a democratically led international order. And I'm hopeful long term for that. But the other thing in the near term that really gives me hope is the younger generation, teaching students, having students from my former class embarking on foreign policy careers with such great success, that the best talent we have is the next generation to help solve the problems that my generation hasn't yet been able to solve. And so that is always inspiring to me.
Well, that's wonderful. And I'm really happy to be in this space. I think that along with this shift, and I completely agree, there's nuanced thinking, there are new thinkers, there are new perspectives. I know that for the longest time in the community, we've been trying to move away from World War II everything, and unfortunately, it's coming on the heels of Ukraine being invaded. However, I do completely agree with you that this definitely is a shift, and it could yield positive results for a more democratic world, right? And democratic international system. So with that, thank you so much, Dr. Amy Zegart, for spending time with us today, your valuable time. I saw your tour schedule, so I know you're busy.
Well, thank you, Nola, for you have the time crunch of finishing your PhD. So I really appreciate your spending time with me today too.
It's due April 4th. So yes.
Plenty of time.
Plenty of time. So there is also on the events page a link to purchase Dr. Zegart's book. You will not be disappointed, and tell a friend. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending, and enjoy the rest of your day.